Oh, hello there, it's Tom.
And Tom.
Here from the Golf is Ruining My Life podcast.
If you love golf, but golf hates you, then you should probably drop in and have a listen, if I'm honest.
Yeah, you really should. Obviously, we're the go-to podcast for anyone suffering the ongoing torture that is the game of golf.
Right now, we're also living our golf dreams.
And I don't mean that golf dream about the talking rabbit with your nan's face who gave you that putt.
What?
That doesn't matter, nothing, move on.
So, yeah, anyway, we've teamed up with PGA Tour 2K25.
Yes, indeed. And, by the way, PGA Tour 2K25 is rated Peggy 3.
To finally allow us to live our golfing fantasies.
Fancy playing in a major? You can do that on PGA Tour 2K25.
Quite keen to design a course? Grab your console and guess what? You can do that on PGA Tour 2K25.
Fancy making a 4-ball scramble or even a cheeky little spot of match play with your cousin in Australia? You can do that on PGA Tour 2K25.
So good. So for exclusive early access to the game and loads more besides, come on over and join us, Tom and Tom, on Golf is Ruining My Life. Brought to you in association with PGA Tour 2K25.
We'll see you soon.
Your nan's face on the body of a rabbit. What's going on there, mate?
Nothing. It's definitely not a recurring dream I keep having at all.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Your data is like gold to hackers, and they'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Welcome to part 2 of this 1865 podcast special, looking back at Nottingham Forest's 1994-95 season 30 years on. In part 1 we heard about how Forest made a brilliant start to life back in the Premiership after promotion and some of the standout results from the first half of the season. In this part we'll hear more from Mark Crossley, David Phillips and Martin Bostock, as well as a few other guests who share their memories of following Forest around that time. As 1994 became 1995, Frank Clark's side sat 5th in the table, with only Blackburn Rovers, Manchester United, Liverpool and Newcastle United ahead of them. But before we go into 1995 properly, we'll recap how Forest got on at the back end of 1994. After the 2-1 win at Manchester United on the 17th of December, there was a 9-day gap before Forest's next game away at Coventry City on Boxing Day. The game finished 0-0, Stuart Pearce missing a penalty against his old club, and the Reds had to be satisfied with a draw. But what's notable, Tom, is that Forest play again the following day on December the 27th when they face Norwich City at home. That sounds unbelievable by modern standards.
Yeah, it's insane, isn't it? And having looked at Ken Small's Forest statistical history, which came out about 20 years ago, we thought it was a typo, didn't we? We thought it might have been like on the 28th or something like that, like 2 days later, because we sometimes used to do games where you used to play on a Saturday, then a Monday night. But having researched intensively for this, we couldn't believe it, could we? And obviously in this day and age, it will never be, it will never take place, that game. It will be like pushed back. But Steve, we've looked at two sides, haven't we? And we thought there'd be like wholesale changes. I know the squads weren't as big then because you only had like 3 or so subs, but the only change was Brian Roy didn't play against Coventry on the Boxing Day, in which Scott Gemmell did. Then he did play the following day. So there was only one change from the two squads, and that's astonishing, isn't it? Looking at the players and obviously the quick turnaround, and it's probably like after the new year, I mean, we played West Ham, which we'll go on to in a second, but it probably just tells the story, doesn't it, of like that mini blip period around about the January and February of that season. But after then, we absolutely kick on, don't we?
Yeah, and no manager nowadays would stand for having to play consecutive games on consecutive days. It just would not happen. But that game against Norwich is notable for Lars Bohinen scoring directly from a corner, and that turned out to be the winning goal. And if you watch the fan video that features Martin Bostock, you'll see that goal scored with the perspective from the Upper Bridgeford as the ball swings in and flies into the far corner over the head of Andy Marshall in the Norwich goal. A great goal, and I think only Lars could have scored a goal like that. You then mention defeat at West Ham on New Year's Eve 1994, Tom. And this was a performance that had Frank Clark fuming. Forest were 3-0 down after a first half which Clark described as their worst of the season. The game was notable, though, for a 19-year-old Paul McGregor scoring his first senior goal for Forest in second-half injury time, having come off the bench. And then we go into 1995. Forest begin the year with a 1-0 win over Crystal Palace on the 2nd of January. This was Forest's 4th league game in 7 days. Ahead of this game at the City Ground, Forest were already without Colin Cooper, Lars Bohinen, David Phillips and Jason Lee. And then on the day of the game, Stan Collymore pulled out due to illness. So an already depleted Forest were depleted even further. Collymore was replaced in the team by Gary Bull. He'd only played a dozen or so games after Frank Clark had signed him from Barnet in the summer of 1993. But in this game, Bull scores his only goal for Forest with a close-range header 13 minutes from time. And Forest win the game 1-0. In scoring that goal, Gary Bull joined a select group of players who have played in just one Premier League game and scored. 3 other players have done that in the Premier League era. Can you name them, Tom?
Unfortunately, I can't, because it's mad, isn't it? I mean, how long the Premier League's been going with this record, and no doubt when you do tell me, I'm not going to know any of them because of all the players what have played in the Premier League. So yeah, far away, go and tell me who they are, and I'm going to probably say I don't remember any of them.
So it's Adrian Newhouse of Wimbledon, Chris David for Fulham, and Josh Harrop for Manchester United. I think that's one for the pub quiz, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's my case because I've never heard any of them. They could knock on my door now. I wouldn't know who they are. But yeah, it just goes to show that sort of the statistics and the bits out there when you go and actually find them. It's crazy, isn't it, at what certain players have done and one game, one goal kind of thing. But yeah, it's insane. And another bit about that is that Gary Bull is the cousin of Wolves legend Steve Bull.
So goals run in the family. The following Saturday, Forest played Plymouth, who were in Division 2 at the time, in the 3rd round of the FA Cup, and they won 2-0. Collymore and Scott Gemmell getting the goals. And this game saw Forest fans allowed to sit in the upper tier of the new Trent end for the first time as the stand moved closer to being fully completed. Joining us now on the 1865 podcast is a Forest fan and author who went to all of the games in the 1994-95 season, home and away. You might also know him for his book, The Church of Stuart Pearce and Other Stories. Joining us is Rich Fisher. Welcome, Rich.
Hello, guys.
So we'll start with your journey as a Forest supporter, because it's a few years before 94-95 that you are starting to follow Forest and support the club. When did you first get into Forest and what was your first game?
So it began for me in the late 80s with the kind of second great Clough team. So you kind of Des Walker, Stuart Pearce, Nigel Clough, Steve Hodge, Steve Sutton kind of era we're talking. And yeah, it was at that time when we were just seemed to be getting to Wembley every year, and suddenly everyone was talking about Forest at school when I was like in equivalent to be like year 5 in, as it's called now, in primary school. So I was like 9, and yeah, I just kind of got swept along with that. Really ended up badgering my dad. He took me to my first game at the beginning of the 89-90 season, which was at home against Arsenal, and which we lost. But that was it. I mean, you know, I think like a lot of people who end up getting deep into a football team, I was just transfixed by that first experience of being at the City Ground and, you know, the greenness of the pitch, just the noise of the crowd, all of it really. It was the start of what's, you know, become a lifelong passion really.
Summer of 1994, we didn't really sign many players, and the one who we did sign was Brian Roy, who's just recently been playing for Holland in the 94 World Cup. I bet that was some signing, saying that was linked with a Dutch international at the time.
Yeah, I mean, he played in the World Cup that summer in the States. And I mean, I'll hold my hands up. My main knowledge of him, that he was brilliant in Sensible World of Soccer at that time, which was a game I squandered probably more of my youth years than I would care to admit playing. But yeah, I mean, he obviously, I think he was very much established as a left winger when we signed him. But then I think Frank Clark surprised everybody by almost playing him as kind of like a 10 behind Stan Collymore. And he was absolutely brilliant. I mean, that season I went to the Ipswich game, which was the opening game of the Premier League for us. And he scored the only goal of the game on what was his league debut for us. Lovely, lovely goal. And, I think straight away you could see, wow, I think he'd impressed in pre-season as well, to be fair. But yeah, to sort of see him deliver in the opening game of the season and bring us 3 points, I think everyone. I remember we were like, wow, we've got ourselves a real player. Him and Collymore were just stunning to watch that season. We started brilliant. I think we were top at one point, sort of going around October. I don't think we lost until sort of, I'm going to say, it's a long time ago now. Without consulting the archives, I'm going to say I'm sure we were unbeaten for like the first 10 games.
You can ask us doing this research. We've got the answers in front of us. It was Blackburn on the 30th of October of that season at the City Ground. We lost 2-0.
No, they were a bit of a bogey team for us around that time. We go a year, and a year later there was the infamous 7-0 away defeat, which ended, I think, 25 games unbeaten. But yeah, that's jumping a bit ahead. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly as a newly promoted team, I think we probably surpassed everybody's expectations, including our own, in terms of how well we start that season. I mean, the standout game for me during the opening part of the season was Spurs away, where we just absolutely demolished them. And probably one of my favourite ever goals that I've ever seen, the Lars Bohinen's chip, where even the Spurs fans were applauding. It was that good, which is something you don't often see. But yeah, I was quite lucky as well. That season was the season when a lot of Premier League teams were rebuilding big parts of their grounds to be compliant with the Taylor Report's recommendations on that all grounds after Hillsborough need to be all-seater. And because of that, there were limited away tickets for a lot of games. I think that Spurs game, Forest had only been given something like 300 tickets. I mean, clearly we could have sold 10 times that and some more. And yeah, myself and my brother and others managed to get our hands on some by queuing overnight. When back then, obviously it's very different now with online, but back then tickets would just go on sale at the ticket office on a Saturday morning. And yeah, we got down there on the Friday evening, and along with various other similar-minded idiots, just toughed it out overnight in the City Ground car park and got to go to Spurs. But absolutely regret none of that. It was great.
It's all worth it.
There was one, I think there was 3 or 4 times that season we ended up doing that. And there was one time when it was going into the colder months, and one of the Forest directors at the time kind of walked past and was like looking at us thinking, poor bastards, having to sit out here and he actually said, look, I'm going to leave a gate to the ground open so at least you can use the toilet facilities and stuff, which is a really lovely gesture. I mean, needless to say, though, a load of young lads who have, got partaking in a bit of underage drinking to help stave off the colds. We abused that immensely. I mean, there was somebody managed to acquire a football, so there was a bit of a kickabout on the pitch. I think somebody ended up climbing up one of the floodlight pylons and all sorts of shenanigans. I climbed into the director's box. We were just like kind of exploring the ground in the middle of the night. It was. I remember finding that they actually left the heating on in the director's box. So I remember going there. We kept having take it in turns. Like somebody would keep our place in the queue, and the rest of us would just wander off and do whatever. But yeah, I remember having about a 2-hour kip in the middle of the night in the director's box. It was nice and warm to let the heating on. So
absolutely brilliant.
That's amazing.
But talking about the tickets and obviously with the Taylor report, with you starting to go Forest from like the late 80s, I bet you can slowly start seeing these grounds going from like the ramshacks, which were in the 70s and 80s. I know there were great memories back then, but then going into these like brand new sparkling stadiums, I bet you could see the sea change during that 94-95 season.
Yeah, definitely. Although it's funny, I mean, you kind of look at a lot of grounds, they just flung seats in where they used to be terracing, and certainly, you kind of think you see a big change now. As a fan now, we go to game places like Anfield, and the concourses are massive, and they've got all sorts of shiny facilities, and then you've got like the back of the Brian Clough stand at Forest, which is just mayhem and really cramped. And I think in some ways, I think some grounds where they've perhaps done it properly, it was a significant change. But I think a lot of grounds, it's a case of just seats being shoved onto what used to be terracing and not really making much improvements to the actual amenities and facilities, really. I don't know. We're football fans, aren't we? We're so hardwired to, having to put up with that sort of thing, but we just get on with it, don't we?
City and Chelsea in particular were, you were absolutely like going back in time. I mean, I was thinking about this today. The ironic thing is that the stadium that hasn't changed and probably should change is Hillsborough. Hillsborough's still an awful ground, and the Leppings Lane end should have been demolished, well, in the early 90s. But, Blackburn, blimey, Blackburn was like one of the stand to your right from the away end was like a cattle shed. Probably looked like the Trent End, to be honest. But, Blackburn was an awful ground. So, it really changed football. I mean, quite a few of my friends didn't think it was for the better, but I certainly do. I think the grounds now are a lot better, and you know that you're going to walk into a ground and you're probably going to get a brilliant view. Even
like looking at on your video, Chelsea, and that was like half the old ground with the running track where they used to park the cars behind the goal. Then obviously, then they built the Matthew Harding stand, didn't they? Kind of thing. So there's like grounds like that, and then Upton Park, which I used to love going to Upton Park, and I've gone to that anti-football stadium, as I call it, in Stratford. But even there, from your video, it doesn't look a very nice away section at Upton Park, because you're on a side stand looking at it, and you were like up in the gods, and then with like stanchions in the way. The funny thing was that during that time, because they were doing all the building work, you got shunted round. Spurs for the Spurs game, we were in the side. City, I can't remember which stand we were in then, but I remember I've been sat with Forest, I've been in 3 stands at Main Road. We got moved around that much. I think Leeds were, if I remember rightly, Leeds were rebuilding then, because I think I struggled to get a ticket to sit in the Leeds end. I think for that year, which wasn't a pleasurable experience, even though we lost. But the grounds football was really changing then, and it was for the better, and it was obviously needed. And with the power of the internet now, I mean, as we record this on the 3rd of December, I managed to get my Wolves ticket, which within a minute I've got a ticket. Basically, 2 clicks and I'm going to Molyneux. But what was it like getting tickets back then? Because I think Forest were one of the last side to actually embrace the internet ticketing, because I remember early noughties at any big fixture, it was a camp in the main stand car park type of thing. But how was it getting tickets back then for specialist Premier League season we're talking about? Forest ticket office has always been horrendous. So that, to be honest, I've had good experiences in the last couple of years. But the problem was for us is because we live in Yorkshire, you couldn't just go down to the ticket office. I mean, in those days, I did rely on
I had friends round Nottingham who'd, thankfully, they'd go and queue up at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever to get me tickets. The reason why quite a few of us met who were on the video was that there was a Yorkshire Forest Supporters Club, and we all really met through that. That's how I met Julie, who I travel with now. And that was the only way of coming together. And then they got an allocation for the matches, so it made it easier, because you can't imagine it now, but you used to have to send off. We had to send off a postal application, which I normally did. And touch wood, I always did all right with tickets, apart from I missed the Sheffield United playoff at Bramall Lane. But yeah, you had to post an application. I mean, can you imagine that? It's either going to get lost on the way there, lost on the way back, or lost in Forest ticket office. So you were going to be lucky if you got a ticket.
Now we move on to January the 25th, 1995. It's a Wednesday night and there's a number of midweek Premiership fixtures. In one of them, Forest face Chelsea at Stamford Bridge and they win 2-0 thanks to a brace by Stan Collymore. A good win for Forest away from home, but the game is overshadowed by events elsewhere in London. Crystal Palace are hosting Manchester United at Selhurst Park. 4 minutes into the second half, United striker Eric Cantona is sent off for kicking Palace defender Richard Shaw. As he walks down the touchline towards the tunnel, Cantona launches a kung fu kick at Palace supporter Matthew Simmons. I know this isn't a Forest-related story, Tom, but this was a massive event, not only in football, but it made national headlines too because it was so shocking and so unexpected.
Yeah, it was pretty seismic, wasn't it, of what happened? And I think it was, to be honest, I'm surprised. I'm not condoning what Cantona did, but I'm just surprised it hasn't happened more, because as football fans, we pay our money and everything, and people say, oh, you should have an opinion and voice like your angst and concerns, etc. But at the end of the day, we've heard, haven't we, over the years, from what Matthew Simmons, his version of events, and Cantona's version of events, and something like that. Like I says, I'm surprised it hasn't happened more in the game with the views what certain players get. But basically, with all the ramifications with it, he got obviously suspended for the remainder of that 95 or 94-95 season, fined, and then did he have a suspended jail sentence as well? And at the time, Eric Cantona was Manchester United, wasn't he? He wouldn't say carried that team, but he was like the focal point of that team with the goals, creativity. But I think that event, obviously Eric Cantona didn't know it at the time, but it basically handed the title to Blackburn Rovers. But having said that, the title race was a lot closer than some people may remember, because they went to Liverpool, didn't they? I think did they lose or get?
They lost. They lost, and Man United drew at West Ham, and it was enough to give Blackburn the title. Yeah. So and it went to the wire, didn't it? But you fought it on the 25th of January 95 with what Cantona did. He potentially, we all thought at the time it was massive, and even looking back, it was still a shock, wasn't it? It's what he did.
Here, Cantona's getting involved with some supporters. Oh, this is outrageous. Norman Davis, the Manchester United kitman, trying to pull him away. It's all got wildly out of hand, and once more, Eric Cantona is the man at the centre of a dramatic controversy.
Forest's form in the January and February of 1995 was patchy. The win at Chelsea and a home draw against Liverpool was sandwiched between defeats to Blackburn, Aston Villa, Newcastle and Arsenal. The Arsenal game is interesting because it's played on the 21st of February 1995, the same day that Arsenal manager George Graham was sacked after a Premier League inquiry found he had received bungs totalling more than £400,000 from the transfers of John Jensen and Paul Lyderson to Highbury. Hours before that night's game, Graham was gone and Stuart Houston placed in charge. I had no idea until researching for this podcast that all of this happened on the same day that Forest were due to play Arsenal.
Things somehow always come back to Forest somewhere down the line regarding these certain situations, because of obviously George Graham losing his job at Arsenal due to these bung payments. And if you remember at the start of the 90s, Brian Clough and we're not trying to paint him in a bad light here, we're just reporting, telling you how it is in the early 90s, is that Alan Sugar said in Parliament, didn't he, when he was protected, that Cloughie liked a bum kind of thing. Then it was later revealed regarding all this investigation by the Premier League and the FA that Forest, former assistant manager in the latter years of Brian Clough's career at Forest, Ron Fenter picked up £45,000 in Hull from a fishing trawler. We all know that football's a bit of a shady business, but thankfully for the football club, not so much Brian Clough, because they did say that the charge was dropped because of his ill health, and they were satisfied that he was never going to make a return into football again, as with Ron Fenton. And for everything what Brian Clough's given the game and given Nottingham Forest, it's just like there's just this black mark next to his name because of obviously his business activities, which thankfully for him, he didn't get charged. So as they say, innocent until proven guilty. But the FA at the time, and I think Rick Parry was part of the panel, that the evidence was quite damning. But I think, as we all know, George Graham carried the can for this, didn't he, and took the rep and banned from football for a year, until he returned in the summer of '96 at Leeds United.
And Arsenal beat Forest in that first game of the post-Graham era, winning 1-0 with a goal from Chris Kiwomya 9 minutes from time. Forest also went out of the FA Cup around this time, didn't they, Tom? In the fourth round at home to Crystal Palace.
They did. I think because of the season what we had, and if we was like hovering around mid-table, I probably would have. I'm not saying that we took our eye off the ball in the FA Cup, but with the prize at stake at the end of the season, might qualify for Europe. I think all our eggs were in that basket, weren't they? This particular game, but yeah, as I say, when clubs are like struggling towards the bottom of the league, FA Cup or any cup match for that matter, it's usually a good distraction, isn't it? And that's obviously what happened here with Crystal Palace beating us in the FA Cup, and then obviously it made us concentrate on the league.
Where's the help for Roy? It's coming from Wone, and here is Ian Wone. Oh, he swung a great ball in. Well, that is really a superb goal, and it's gone to one of the unfashionable honest pros of English football this season. Steve Stone, what a perfection. Stone is the covering player. Good composure from Wilson. Good cross too. Les Ferdinand. This time it will count for Queen's Park Rangers. And Simon Barker got the precious vital touch.
That draw at QPR in late February was the start of an unbeaten run that would take Forest all the way to the end of the season. Around this time, though, there were reports of rifts in the Forest dressing room, particularly surrounding Stan Collymore, who'd attracted interest from Manchester United and Liverpool. He didn't go to United in the end because they signed Andy Cole from Newcastle in the January. But it brings us back to the point that Forest's success in this season was helped by how well Frank Clark and the players managed Collymore and his personality.
Yeah, well, we all know that Forest are a big club, but they've got a certain ceiling, especially back then, because obviously you had Manchester United and Liverpool. And looking back, Stan Collymore, 23, 24 at the time, he's had a relatively decent season at Forest at that point. And when one of the big clubs come knocking, it's obvious, isn't it, that your head's going to be turned. And Forest did manage Stan Collymore pretty well. They basically cut him a bit of slack. We all know that he didn't turn up for training every day. He wasn't probably the best trainer, disciplinary issues, but as long as he was turning up on a Saturday or any match day, 9 times out of 10 he delivered, and he did. 22 goals this season, and yeah, it was absolute for that 2 years. I know we keep going back to Collymore and waxing lyrical over him, but yeah, for those 2 years, and any Forest fan around that era who watched Forest probably would say that Collymore was probably the best player they've seen in the flesh. And when you look at his goals on YouTube, and he actually did a video, didn't the Collymore years, just goes to show how good of a player Stan Collymore was, because he had absolutely everything. And obviously, if managers and who had him after Forest probably understood him a bit more, would be calling Stan Collymore one of the greats in this country. But he retired in 2001, 2002, and it's a real shame for a player who had that much talent at his disposal.
Next up for Forest was Spurs at the City Ground, a 2-2 draw which saw all 4 goals scored in an 8-minute period. What's even more remarkable is that the first goal in the game didn't come until the 79th minute. Teddy Sheringham puts Tottenham ahead against his old club. Lars Bohinen then responds for Forest with a 25-yard screamer, hammering the ball past Ian Walker. It's one of the goals of the season. And then a minute later, Tom, Forest take the lead through super sub Jason Lee, who runs onto a long ball forward, beats Walker to it and taps in.
Yeah, he was a decent player for us, wasn't he, when needed, Jason Lee? I mean, he was ridiculed by Badillion Skinner on fantasy football, and he took a hell of a lot of stick. And I know they've apologised in recent years because obviously he was going to the point of it being racist. But to his credit, Jason Lee never let anybody down. I mean, he wasn't the most technically gifted player, but his effort and his desire to obviously, he was willing to put his head in where he was potentially going to get hurt. And when Collymore and Roy weren't there, Jason Lee was there to step in and produce for the side. I mean, he didn't start many games, but when you look back, he did score some important goals for us at important times.
Spurs' equaliser on 87 minutes comes from future Forest manager Colin Calderwood, who taps in from close range to deny the Reds all 3 points. Then on the following Wednesday, Forest get back to winning ways against Everton. Stan Collymore puts Forest ahead with a header, Everton respond through Stuart Barlow, and then we get a Stuart Pearce special. He smashes a 25-yard free kick past Neville Southall at the Trent end, and Forest win 2-1. Next up is an away trip to Leicester City, who'd come up with Forest the season before through the playoffs, and Forest run out 4-2 winners at Filbert Street.
Yeah, exactly. Collymore scores in front of their home end and he's baiting them, and I think they wanted to get at Collymore, but there was an advertising board in the way. But yeah, it just goes to show that Forest were good on the road as they were at home. And this was just the point, wasn't it, Stephen, where we started to get a lot more consistency after that lull period, just after the new year. And from this point, there was no stopping us.
So in comes Stuart Pearce and drives it into the corner. And Forest have the lead on 8 minutes. Pearce arriving in support, and Ian Wone. Collymore in the middle, and Collymore scores! And Forest are back in front again. The counter-attack is on here. Ian Wone. He's got Collymore to his left, Bohinen to his right. It's Wone again. It's going to be another one. 3-1 to Nottingham Forest. And how swiftly and menacingly they broke then from one end of the field to the other. Leicester defenders pushing up, and they've left Bohinen in so much space. Jason Lee, and it's 4-2.
We're getting promoted. You have that momentum which carries on to the next season. And if we'd have started poorly, then things might have been different. But it didn't. We started off really, really well. And as I said, it was that momentum which carried us through. And so we had some games where we didn't win, and there were 2 or 3 of those, and then we won, and then 2 or 3 we lost again. But then it was the last 13 games where everything transpired to be in a really successful season, and obviously finishing 3rd in the Premier League, got us into Europe.
As you mentioned about that start, I mean, we did start really well, and then obviously yourself playing a really prominent role in starting the majority of the games at the start of that season. Were you surprised how well we started, or was it a case of like you just mentioned about the momentum and everything, or was you kind of thinking, well, this is going really well here, so...
Yeah, you tend to find sometimes there is that break in between seasons, and obviously I was involved with Wales as well, but we came back, a couple of additions to the squad which enhanced the squad. It made it stronger, and it was always one of those that we were quick on the transition. We always had quick players. I'll include Woney in that as well. He wasn't too bad. But joking apart, great player, wonder of a left foot. But then you had, people like Steve Stone, he was lightning quick. Brian Roy, lightning quick. Stan Collymore, even quicker. And so there were times where we could suck up the amount of pressure and hit teams on the counter-attack, which we were really, really good at doing. And then when you had Skip as well, Stuart Pearce, who came in with a shed load of goals, whether it be from penalties or free kicks, Everyone had their little bit of identity going into that 94-95 season, and the performances that we played were superb.
I actually watched a few of the games because doing this podcast, and some of the goals what we scored that season, like Collimore's against Man United, and obviously yours at Selhurst Park, it was really good goals. So we did score some lovely goals that season, and then there was the Heenan one against Sheffield Wednesday where I think it was balling in, and I think he scored from a corner that season against your old club, Norwich. So there's some really special goals that season.
Yeah, I would say, like, for me, I didn't contribute too much in respect of goals. Just purely on the basis of, Frank wanted me to do a job and let the others do the job, in respect to scoring goals. So I was more than pleased, again, with the performances that I made, but also the performances of my teammates. And as we said, it was a very successful season.
Colin Cooper was a great player. He was one of these underrated. I always thought Steve Chattel was an underrated player anyway. Only for the fact that he played at the side of Des Walker all the years, that he never got the credit he deserved. So Desi Little was a fullback who was doing really, really well. So we had good underrated players, but we knew how, and we worked so well for each other. We were a good team, There's no doubt about it. We had good wingers as well, the Walneys, and we're a good team.
After beating Leicester, Forest then pick up consecutive 3-0 home wins over Southampton and Leeds. And in both of those games, Brian Roy scores 2, with Stan Collymore netting the other. Collymore's goal against Leeds I want to mention because it's typical Stan. He picks the ball up, powers away from the defenders, and on this occasion he leaves Colton Palmer sprawling on the turf. He falls over as he's trying to chase Collymore down, but he can't catch him, and Collymore slots the ball past John Lukic to wrap the game up for Forest. So Forest have won 4 in a row as we move on to April Fool's Day 1995. Forest head to Hillsborough to face Sheffield Wednesday, and what follows is a performance that no Forest fan who was there will ever forget.
Pierce then comes up. What a great start! Oh, 1-0. Kevin Pressman had absolutely no chance with that. Forest coming in, Bohinen. Wednesday open up gaps here. Bohinen to Wone. Wone is on his left foot. Could it be 2? It is. To Stone. Forest keeping possession well. Phillips. Now to Bohinen. Stone. This is good flowing stuff from Forest to Wone. And on to Brian Roy. It's another goal for Forest. And Forest are tearing Sheffield Wednesday apart. Collymore gets a little touch on to Roy. Roy with his back to goal, on to Collymore. The ball drops for Stone. He's through. Stone to Roy. And it's Roy's second. Brian Roy skipping away from one challenge to Collymore now. Collymore who check onto his right foot. He does, the space opening up here. And that's 5. Forest stretch Wednesday again. Roy. As Forest look for a 6th goal. Roy to Collymore. Surely it is number 6. Collymore. Oh, what a smashing finish. Pierce now. Cut out by Waddle. This Wednesday stick to the task, but Steve Stone easily brushes Waddle aside there. Stone now. Stone to Roy. Bohinen. Oh, what an audacious little chip that is from the Norwegian. It's all over. Crossley applauds, and Collymore illustrates that Forest have turned Wednesday inside out.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
You're listening to 1865, the Nottingham Forest podcast.
That 7-1 victory was the Premiership's biggest ever away win at that point, and to this day it remains one of the all-time great Forest performances.
Yeah, it was, and this was not against the Sheffield Wednesday side who bottomed the league or anything like that. They had a decent few years under Trevor Francis. I mean, they got to the League Cup finals, didn't they? And they had some really good players in their side, if you remember. They had Des Walker, who'd just come back from his stint in Italy with Sampdoria. Chris Waddle come back to England from Marseille, and yeah, they had a really decent side. But yeah, going to Hillsborough on the 1st of April 1995, we absolutely blew them away, didn't we? It's funny, isn't it? The start of the season when we beat Spurs 4-1 and Boheme scored that lob and over Ian Walker, and you got the Spurs fans applauding us. The same happened on this, but on a grander scale in terms of the scoreline, with Sheffield Wednesday fans applauding every goal what went in.
I look at the 7-1 win at Sheffield Wednesday, remember that game, and if you see some of the football played in that game, that season, that was a sign of a proper Nottingham Forest team that play football, which we've always been renowned for. And we did it in the Premier League that year. I remember it's probably my favourite ever season, to be honest. And to finish third that season in the Premier League, totally against all the odds and unexpectedly. I think there were only us really believed that we could do it deep down. The lads in the dressing room, the manager. We believed once we got on a roll that we were pretty unstoppable at home as well. You know, there's not many teams came and beat us.
It's quite telling in that Sheffield Wednesday game when you've got the home fans at Hillsborough applauding Forest as the goals are going in and putting the team off the pitch. Just shows how good they were that day.
I got bored, you know. I had the fans behind me second half and they were singing Norm, Norm, and what's the score? And I honestly forgot what the score was at one stage because it just, I got pretty bored. I was quite happy to let one in the end. I felt sorry for them, you know. But yeah, I mean, yeah, no, joking aside, like, that was a sign of a proper team, yeah.
We just absolutely destroyed them. And it's funny, you sometimes will see teams go 2-3-0 up and just kind of like sit back a little bit thinking we've got this game in the bag. But yeah, just the sheer brutality of that performance. I mean, we just kept piling forward and scoring more goals. I think it was only 2-1 at half time or something, so it's quite close. But yeah, the second half attacking their kind of big cop end, yeah, it was just amazing to watch. We just absolutely demolished them, showed absolutely no mercy. And yeah, what definitely along with the Spurs away game and the Man United away game, that's probably, you know, that's almost certainly one of the ones that I kind of look back on and think, wow, that standout memory of that season.
Now let's hear from someone who covered Forest week in, week out back in the mid-90s. Keith Daniel was a presenter for Central News in the East Midlands, and here he shares some memories of dealing with Frank Clark and Brian Clough.
Hello, this is Keith Daniel. Many years ago, and for many years, I was one of the presenters for ITV, and as a consequence was around when both Brian Clough and indeed Frank Clark were managers of Nottingham Forest. Two incredibly different characters, different personalities, both phenomenal in their way. And I would describe Brian Clough as a charmer, and Frank Clark was and still is charming. The thing about Brian is that he had every rhetorical trick in the book. I was never in the dressing room with him. I was never fortunate enough to be a player, but I suspect the players will tell you quite happily how he created this aura, this belief, this passion that made them feel they could do anything. And certainly whenever I, for example, interviewed Brian, I would come away from that interaction thinking I was the best journalist, I was the best interviewer, I was the best television presenter in the world. Maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes later, I came to a very rapid conclusion that I wasn't. But for that period of time, Brian made you feel special, and he was box office. He knew what he was doing, but he did it brilliantly. Absolutely phenomenal. Frank was a terrific, indeed still is a terrific man. I still see Frank from time to time. He is always charming, will never avoid a question, and will always be polite and courteous and have an opinion. Absolutely outstanding as a bloke. But I don't think Frank would disagree when you say that Frank's skill, Frank's talent, Frank's charm was completely different to what Brian Clough had to offer. And let me just give one really quick example of what Brian was able to do, because I and my wife sat next to Frank Clark and his wife at an event for Stuart Pearce's testimonial. Very pleasant evening. Frank and his wife made wonderful conversation, and my wife came away from that interaction with Frank saying, what a nice bloke. We once had Brian Clough in the studios, and I forget why now, but I had to record this interview with him on a Sunday afternoon. And my wife came in because we didn't have any catering facilities, so she came with me to make Brian a cup of tea. And Brian knew that we had two daughters. I think at the time they must have been something like 10 and 12. And when my wife bought Brian a cup of tea, Brian looked her straight in the eye. And remember, my wife has no interest in football whatsoever. Looked at him and said, it's Alison, isn't it? He said, I've heard a lot about you. Two daughters? I bet one of them's a villain. And at that moment, my wife was absolute putty in Brian Clough's hands, because he knew how to charm, how to manipulate, how to motivate in a way that, frankly, was the work of a genius. As I say, I never had the chance to work with him in the dressing room. I wish I'd been a good enough player to experience that. But as a reporter, as a television presenter, as an interviewer, he made you feel like you were special and could do absolutely everything. So two terrific guys, but very different.
Forest then go on to win their next four on the spin, starting with a 1-0 victory at Carrow Road over Norwich. Steve Stone scoring 5 minutes from the end after being set up by Collymore. Then comes a 2-0 win at home to Coventry before the first of two trips in a fortnight to Selhurst Park. In the first, Forest beat struggling Crystal Palace 2-1. And in this game, Stan Collymore scores another brilliant solo goal. He scored many in his time at Forest, but this one deserves to be ranked up there with his very best.
Yeah, picks up the ball and you look at it now and you think, you know what's going to happen. But at the time, if you're looking at it, it's like, where's he going? Because he goes from one side of the 18-yard box to the other, takes everybody on, then he just absolutely hits it top corner, doesn't he? And I think it was a bit more of a special moment as well for Stan Collymore, because obviously it's against his former club and he got bombed out at Palace and didn't he, to go to Southend in the early 90s. But yeah, it's just a lot of Stan Collymore goals. They were not tap-ins, were they? They were special goals, and a lot of them are self-made. He always picks the ball up from deep, doesn't he? And obviously runs it to the defenders, and no defender likes a player running at them. And yeah, it's just another class goal from Stan the man.
And then the following week, Forest play their final home game of the season, and they beat Man City 1-0 to guarantee themselves European football for the following campaign. Stan Collymore again scores the goal, and he scores it against a 43-year-old John Burridge, who's in goal for Man City on this day.
Yeah, that's another pub question. I think John Burridge is the oldest player to ever play in the Premier League. And if you look at him, he's a typical journeyman, started his career in the 70s, I believe, and didn't wrap up and playing until like the late 90s. But if you remember, this isn't the Man City of what we know now. This was the Man City we were like used to struggle, didn't they, in the mid 90s? They were well in the shadow of Manchester United, who were winning everything on the other side of Manchester. But yeah, European football's guaranteed for the following season, and Frank Clark doesn't get the credit he deserved to take a team who, let's not forget, in the summer of 1993, it's like the citadel falling, wasn't it, with Brian Clough leaving, of everything what he's achieved in the game. And sometimes you have an identity crisis, don't you? Like what happened at Manchester United with Ferguson leaving. It takes a long time for that club. And I know later on it took us 23 years to get back into the Premier League, but to get that club up, well, our club, first time of asking, get into the Premier League, finish in third, and then get into the quarterfinals of the UEFA Cup. That is absolutely brilliant. And in recent times, everybody says how good Wolves have been when they got promoted under Nuno, who's obviously our current manager at the moment. But yeah, to get us into third place, finishing the Premiership back then, it's unbelievable. And not only Frank, but the players don't get the credit that they deserve. It was just a brilliant achievement.
And Forest's final game of the season is away to Wimbledon. And in a strange quirk of the fixture computer, Forest's final 2 away fixtures are both at Selhurst Park. This is the days when Crystal Palace ground shared with Wimbledon. So the penultimate away game of the season, Forest play Palace away. And then the final away game of the season, they play Wimbledon away. And it was a 2-2 draw in the end. David Phillips gives Forest the lead with a screamer from 25 yards. He seemed to specialise in the spectacular David Phillips. Dean Holdsworth scores twice for Wimbledon, once from the penalty spot to put them 2-1 up. And then Steve Stone equalises for Forest in the second half. And 2-2 it finishes. But there was a bit more going on at Selhurst Park that day, wasn't there, Tom?
There was. So the colourful owner at the time, Sam Haman, or for some reason, it'd been a great idea to parade a full-size elephant around Selhurst Park pitch. And looking back and looking at the research, and I've looked, you've looked, we don't know the reason, do we? And I know they're called the Crazy Gang, but this was just up there of some of the daft things Wimbledon used to do in the day. And even, I know, Sam Haman and the Crazy Gang, like I said, they just did some daft things, but I think this topped the lot, didn't it, parading. I could understand if there was, like Coventry, for example, they've got an elephant on their badge, but there's no elephant on Wimbledon's badge. And it's like we was already qualified for Europe, so if it was like an attempt to put us off a game or something, but if you look at the pictures and they still come out in the corner, don't they, where the Homesdale Road stand is at Selhurst Park, and you can see this picture, can't you, of the Forest players, and they're like thinking, what the bloody hell's an elephant doing
Just a
here?
giant elephant stood next to them, It's utterly bonkers.
It is, but it's just a sign of the times for Wimbledon. They were a very colourful club, weren't they, with the quirks and the things what they used to do. But it's definitely up there as one of the weirdest moments in Premier League history.
2-2 it finishes, and that means at the end of the season that Forest finished third in the Premiership table. It's worth mentioning though, Tom, that this final day was eventful elsewhere. So we had the title race between Blackburn and Manchester United. Going into the final day, Blackburn led the way and United were 2 points behind them. Blackburn had 89 points, United had 87. Blackburn, managed by Kenny Dalglish, were away at Anfield against Liverpool, Dalglish's former team, and United were at Upton Park playing West Ham. And this was probably the first time where, certainly in the Sky era, that the title had gone down to the final day. Sky are showing both games live on different channels, and it proved to be eventful, and it did go right down to the wire.
Definitely. Alan Shearer, he was unbelievable this season, wasn't he, for Blackburn? He basically, they're his goals. I know Chris Sutton scored his fair amount of goals, but Alan Shearer was on another level, wasn't he? And he scored early, but then Jamie Redknapp scored a brilliant free kick. And this was, you got to remember, this is an era before mobile phones, so you still had people coming into the grounds with like ghetto blasters, handheld stereos and things like that. And if you look at the footage, there's Kenny Dalglish is just stood next to the tunnel at Anfield, and a Liverpool fan just taps him on his shoulder and says, Man U drawing us at Upton Park. But if you look at the footage from the Man U game, Ludo McCloskey, who was West Ham legend, well, he still is a West Ham legend, the Czech goalkeeper, he was in superb form, if you remember. And this is why we love football. When things go down to the wire, we love how things are riding on the final game of the season. And people probably looking back thinking, I thought Blackburn won it, the Premier League, or the Premiership as it was then, miles in front of Man United, because of obviously Cantona being suspended for the rest of the season. But it wasn't like that, was it, Steve? And it really went to the last game of the season. And in both games, if you look at them in isolation, they're brilliant games to watch. There's a lot riding on them, and there was a lot of entertainment in the two games as well.
And ultimately, it was Blackburn who won the title. That draw for Manchester United at West Ham meant that they couldn't overtake Rovers. And They were champions at Anfield and the trophy was paraded, and Kenny Dalglish joined that select group of managers to have won the top division title with 2 different teams. Forest do finish third behind Blackburn and Man United. Forest are 12 points off the champions, Blackburn, and 11 behind Man United, with 22 wins, 11 draws and 9 defeats from their 42 games, giving them a total of 77 points. Realistically, Tom, Forest were never in the title reckoning. Certainly as it went down to the final stages of the season, it was all about Blackburn against Man United. But that doesn't take away from Forest's achievements, because they're one of only 2 clubs to have got promoted to the Premier League and finished third on their first season in the league.
Yeah, another thing, realistically, European football wasn't even on our radar, was it, at the start of the season? As Mark Crossley mentioned in this pod, that it was survival, having been relegated in the inaugural Premiership season of 92-93. So, yeah, it's an unbelievable achievement, isn't it? And yet, looking back, if Forest probably made a few of the results from the October to the February, made the draws into wins and made the losses into draws, etc. But yeah, it's a phenomenal season to finish third from a newly promoted club. Fair play, and the players don't get enough credit; they deserve it. It's an absolute phenomenal season, and you got to remember is that this is the last Premier League season where they had 22 teams in it. So effectively, 4 teams were going to go down. So obviously, with Forest aspirations of survival, Forest needed to make sure that we're not one of those teams. But obviously, they were never in a relegation battle all season, were they? Looking back on these results here, look, even at the start of the season, we didn't lose a game until the October, and that's phenomenal. You're trying to say now to a Premier League promoted side, go unbeaten until October. It's unheard of, isn't it? And it's a phenomenal record and a phenomenal season for us.
And the story of the season is kind of those 2 long unbeaten runs at the beginning and end, with that iffy form in the middle. And yeah, had it not been for that iffy form, Forest might have been closer to Blackburn and Man United. But nevertheless, what they achieved that season was incredible. Forest qualified for the UEFA Cup for the 95-96 season. And that's the first time in 11 years that they'll have played in Europe since qualifying for the 1984-85 edition of the UEFA Cup. Also worth noting that the form of Forest players had caught the attention of international sides. At the end of the season, Colin Cooper and Stan Collymore earned international call-ups for England. Terry Venables names them in the squad for the Umbro Cup, which was a mini tournament that sort of served as a dry run for Euro 96, which England was hosting the following summer. Stuart Pearce is also in this England squad for the tournament. Cooper makes his debut in the 3-3 game against Sweden and then earns his second cap in England's defeat to Brazil. Stan Collymore makes his debut in the opening game against Japan, which England win, and he also comes on as a sub against Brazil for his second cap. Now, neither of them really, Cooper or Collymore, made a lasting impact for England. In fact, Cooper doesn't play again internationally, but at the time both of their call-ups were fully deserved, and the way that Forest had performed in this season, it's testament to how good that team was that the likes of Colin Cooper and Stan Collymore won international caps at this time.
Yeah, it was, and obviously, I mean, I know Terry Venables had what did he have, like 2 years up until Euro 96, so he's trying a lot of players, but you've still got to be good enough to get an England cap. And I know, as you've just mentioned, that Collymore and Colin Cooper didn't really make a lasting impression on any England squad, but it just goes to show that they were doing the right things back then and playing really well. And obviously Collymore's 22 goals that season, and obviously the 20-odd goals he scored the season before just goes to show how good he was. And if you remember at the time, England had so many strikers who were capable of playing for England. So your notable 2 were obviously Sheringham and Shearer, but then you had Ian Wright, Paul Merson, who didn't really get a look in under Venables, Les Ferdinand, Dion Dublin, Matt Le Tissier could play as a striker, and obviously Robbie Fowler. And so there's a lot of strikers then. Get anywhere near them, you need to be doing something right. And unfortunately, standing his later career, players, managers, etc., probably didn't understand him, hence why he had his demons. And I know there's like a lot of things out there to help players in this day and age, but simply in the 90s, if you remember it, things were not there. You had like John Gregory and Doug Ellis when he was at Aston Villa. he says, if you're earning X amount of money, how can you be depressed? But you can have all the money in the world and still feel that sense of isolation. But yeah, looking back, Stan Collymore will never be forgotten in terms of how good he was in those 2 seasons. He was absolutely phenomenal, and he's been named in the past, hasn't he? As when we've done like greatest teams officially, when Forest did it for the 150th anniversary, Collymore was in there, and he was good as anything, wasn't he? In those 2 seasons we had him.
And in the years that follow, so 95, 96, Forest don't quite hit those same heights again. Stan Collymore moves on to Liverpool in the summer for £8.5 million. At the time, the biggest transfer fee that Forest had ever received. And Forest, the following season, finished 9th. They get to the quarterfinals of the UEFA Cup and end up being beaten by Bayern Munich, who go on to win the trophy. And then the following season, things really unravel. Frank Clark leaves as Forest are struggling in the December of 96-97. Stuart Pearce takes over as caretaker. Dave Bassett comes in as well. Ultimately, Forest end up relegated in 1997. And that brings an end to 3 incredible years of real ups and downs. But to bring it back to 94, 95, Tom, and looking back on that season and kind of what that season meant to Forest fans, it was a really special time, wasn't it? And the achievements of that Forest team, even 30 years on, are really impressive.
Yeah, definitely. And like I mentioned, for a team to obviously get relegated, get promoted, and then it's absolutely phenomenal, isn't it? And a lot of credit has to go to Frank Clark for basically enticing Stan Collymore to come to the club, first and foremost. Then obviously getting Stuart Pearce to stay and obviously keeping the core of that side together. And obviously it just snowballed, didn't it? Los Bohinen joined, Brian Roy joined. Yeah, and everything was just balanced in that team. Even now, I mean, I know we've had a lot of players sign for us over the last few years, etc. But if you just say to any Forest fan, go to 94, 95, name the team, everybody can name that team because it was so balanced, they were so consistent, and we absolutely loved them, didn't we? And I know the world's changed a lot, and I don't want to get all misty-eyed or nostalgic, but yeah, back in the 90s, it was brilliant. You had the Britpop era, 1996, England hosted the European Championships, and England obviously losing on penalties to Germany in the semi-final at Wembley. But that period, everything just intertwined into one, didn't it? And I mean, it's just a phenomenal time to be alive, really, because it's like you had the youth and you had the, like I said, the Britpop, and yeah, you look back and brilliant time, mid-90s, England, yeah, phenomenal time, and coupled with Forest doing well as well.
Yeah, Forest were right there in the middle of it all, one of the best teams in the country, and it was a side as well that seemed to capture the imagination of fans, of football fans in general, and certainly football fans of a certain age still talk about this Forest side fondly. They've almost become a cult team in the years that have followed.
Yeah, they're really endearing characters, weren't they? If you look back, and you always speak fondly about Forest. I mean, we've had Mark Crossley and talking about his time at Forest, and he probably will say it's probably his happiest time in football. Stan Collymore will probably say the same. Stuart Pearce, he had 12 brilliant years as captain, 10 years as captain in his first 2 years, obviously, in Bury he was captain. But then you had like the likes of Ian Wone, we know he's from Runcorn, but he still lives in Nottingham. And you had Steve Stone, and then we had David Phillips, and he talks fondly about his time. And yeah, it's just, I know it's easy when a team like that's successful, you're going to talk fondly about it, but 30 years on, it's just phenomenal. And in Forest history, this team will never ever be forgotten, because I do definitely think they're up there with the likes of the European Cup winning sides and Clough's team of the late 80s. I think they were that good, and it would have been nice if we would have kept it together for like a 3-4 year period, and might have picked up a trophy.
It was a brilliant season. It was great times. I mean, I was 22, not married, so I had that freedom. Check the wife isn't around, but yeah, there was 4 lads in a. I had an old Cavalier. My mate, I had a XR 3 eyes, and we used to go everywhere. Used to have a really good time.
I guess it's different now. I mean, obviously we did end up finishing 3rd, and you think that's a Champions League place now. Obviously, European competition was a bit different then. It was kind of, the Euro. I think it would have still been the European Cup then, the European Cup Winners' Cup, and then obviously we ended up in the UEFA Cup, and then they had the something called the Intertoto Cup, which I think there was a possible, we might end up in that, which is like kind of a qualifying tournament where if you won that, you then got through to UEFA Cup. But I don't know, you almost back and think, only got into the UEFA Cup when you think that would have been a Champions League place now. But, no complaints. The UEFA Cup run following season was brilliant. Yeah.
It's always one of those that you strive for success. And success was trying to get ourselves into Europe. But I think possibly was it a case that we might have been a little bit surprised where we finished? I don't think so. With the form that we were in, there were a lot of sides who came to Forest, to the City Ground, who feared us. And we feared nobody. And that was the way that Frank Clark instilled all this confidence into players. And it wasn't a case that we went on this run and there was any sort of complacency, because sometimes when you are on these sort of runs, you get a little bit complacent and, sometimes you end up losing a game because of that. But there was no complacency at all in that side. And that was drummed in not only by Frank Clark, but when you have a phenomenal skipper in Stuart Pearce, he was one to make sure that we never dropped our standards.
And that brings us to the end of this journey back through Nottingham Forest's 1994-95 season. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our thanks go to our brilliant guests Mark Crossley, David Phillips, Martin Bostock, Rich Fisher and Keith Daniel for sharing their stories and their memories. And finally, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger. Because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.